The town of Willow Creek was never loud. Even the wind that crossed its valley spoke in whispers, as if it feared to disturb the ghosts that still lingered beneath the cottonwoods. Each morning, the sun climbed over the eastern ridge and spilled gold across the plains, lighting up the roofs of weathered barns and the chipped signs above the mercantile. The world seemed to hold its breath before the day began. Ethan Carter had lived his whole life here. The creak of his porch boards, the faint scent of horses and hay, the lazy rhythm of crickets after sundown, all of it had settled deep into his bones. What hadn't settled, though, was peace. It had been 3 years since Lily, his wife, had passed in the spring fever that swept through the valley. Her laughter still echoed in the walls of the old Carter ranch house. But now it was only him and his 6-year-old daughter, Rose, and the silence that filled what used to be laughter's space. He rose before dawn every day, feeding the horses, checking the fences, working the soil that refused to forget her footsteps. It was a simple life, honest and hard, but in the quiet moments when the morning fog rolled through the fields, he felt a kind of ache he couldn't bury with labor. Rose would come running across the yard in her mother's old sun hat, giggling, her braids bouncing, and that would keep him moving. She was the piece of Lily he had left, the living proof that love could linger after death. But lately, Rose had been asking questions no father was ready to answer. "Papa, why don't you smile anymore?" He'd look at her, force a grin, and say, "Guess I forgot how, darling. Maybe you can remind me." That morning, as he hitched the wagon and set out toward town to deliver grain, the sky was brushed with pale amber clouds. He wasn't expecting anything different, just another day, another small circle on the calendar of surviving. But when he turned onto Main Street, reins in hand, the air seemed to shift. A figure stood near the edge of the general store, her gloved hands resting lightly on a suitcase. Her black dress had faded to soft gray, her hat tipped low against the wind. For a second, Ethan thought his memory was tricking him. Then she looked up, and he saw Clara Whitmore. His breath hitched. The last time he'd seen her, she was standing beside a coffin, her husband's, outside the very same church where he'd buried Lily. Clara had left town not long after that, boarding a train westward, her eyes empty. Her words swallowed by grief. No one had heard from her since. Now she was back, standing in front of him like a memory that had chosen to live again. Ethan didn't know if he should speak or tip his hat and keep driving. But Rose, perched beside him on the wagon seat, saw the woman too. "Papa," she said softly, "that lady looks sad." Ethan's fingers tightened on the reins. "Yeah," he murmured, voice low. "Maybe she's been sad a long time." He drove past her, trying to steady the pounding in his chest, but Clara's gaze lifted, and their eyes met, just for a heartbeat. It was enough to bring everything rushing back. The laughter they'd once shared at town socials, the kindness she'd shown Lily when sickness came, the way her letters had stopped after her husband's death. The wind carried a faint whisper of her name, and for the first time in years, Ethan felt something stir, something he'd thought had died with his wife. Clara didn't recognize the town at first. The paint was peeling on the old post office, the church bell had gone silent, and the saloon, once alive with the hum of fiddles and laughter, looked weary with time. But what unsettled her most wasn't how the place had changed. It was how she had. When she'd left Willow Creek 4 years ago, she'd promised herself she'd never return. Her husband, Thomas Whitmore, had been a good man, maybe too good for the world he lived in. He'd ridden out one morning to break a Mustang that never wanted breaking, and the horse came back without him. The town had whispered it was foolish pride, but Clara knew it was just life, cruel and sudden. In the city, she'd worked as a seamstress, lived in quiet rooms, kept her heart packed away like the letters she never sent. But when her father fell ill, and the letter came from the local pastor asking her to return, she'd boarded the train without hesitation. She told herself it was duty, not longing, that pulled her back. Now, standing on the dusty street, suitcase in hand, she felt the weight of every year she'd been gone. Then she saw him, Ethan Carter. He was older now, broader in the shoulders, quieter in the eyes. His beard had more grey than she remembered, and yet there was something unchanged, the same steady calm that once made everyone around him feel safe. She hadn't expected to feel her chest tighten, but it did. When their eyes met, the world seemed to still. She wanted to turn away, pretend she hadn't seen him, but some invisible thread held her still. He looked at her with a gentleness that felt like sunlight after too many winters. Then he nodded, tipping his hat slightly, and the wagon rolled on. Only after he passed did Clara realize she'd been holding her breath. Later that day, after unpacking her few belongings in her father's old house, she went out to the garden. The lilacs were wild now, the fence half fallen. She knelt, touched the earth, and for the first time in years she wept. Not loudly, not desperately, just the soft, tired tears of someone who's forgotten how to cry. From across the field, Ethan's ranch wasn't far. He could see the faint outline of her house from his porch when the evening sun sank low. That night, as he stood with a cup of coffee and the cicadas started their slow song, he saw a lantern flicker in her window. A tiny light in the dark, and somehow that light reached him. It was Rose who brought them together again. Children have a way of crossing boundaries adults build with silence. A week after Clara's return, Ethan rode into town for supplies. Rose followed her friend down the dusty street and wandered near the old schoolyard, where Clara had been volunteering to help clean and reopen the place. When Rose tripped on a broken plank and scraped her knee, Clara rushed over, lifting her gently and cleaning the wound with water from her canteen. "There now, sweetheart," she said softly, tying a strip of her handkerchief around the cut. "You'll be fine." Rose sniffled but smiled. "You sound like my mama used to." The words hit Clara like a quiet storm. She looked up, and there he was again. Ethan stood by the fence, hat in hand, eyes full of both gratitude and something deeper, unspoken. "Thank you." "Clara," he said, voice low, sincere. She rose slowly, dusting her skirt. "It's just a scratch," she said, though her heart was beating fast. For a moment, they stood there, two people who had known too much loss, too much quiet, and yet somehow found each other again in a world that rarely gave second chances. Over the next weeks, life in Willow Creek began to shift. Ethan started finding excuses to visit town more often. Clara began baking again, bringing fresh bread to the church gatherings. They'd talk in brief moments, about crops, about Rose, about small things that carried big meanings. And one evening, as the sunset burned gold over the horizon, Ethan walked Clara home. The air smelled of sage and rain. "I didn't think I'd see you again," he said quietly. Clara smiled faintly. "I didn't think I'd come back." They stopped at her gate. Silence hung between them, not heavy but alive. Then she looked at him, really looked, and saw not the man she'd once known, but the man grief had carved into something softer, stronger. "Ethan," she began, but her voice broke. He reached out, not touching her, just close enough that she could feel the warmth of his hand through the space between them. "You don't have to say anything," he whispered. "Just don't leave again." The wind stirred the lilacs, her eyes glistened, her lips trembled, and for the first time since her husband's death, Clara Whitmore cried in someone's presence. Ethan didn't move closer. He simply let her be. Because healing, he knew, wasn't something you could force. It was something that bloomed slowly, like spring after a long, hard winter. And as the evening deepened into starlight, the two of them stood by that old gate, the widow and the single father, as the town of Willow Creek, for the first time in years, seemed to breathe again. The days in Willow Creek began to move differently after Clara's return. What once felt like a stretch of quiet years now passed in gentle rhythm, marked by the rising of the sun over the wheat fields, the low hum of the blacksmith's hammer, and the sound of laughter that slowly began returning to the Carter ranch. Clara became a familiar sight in town again. Folks greeted her with cautious smiles at first. Small-town memories ran deep, and ghosts of the past often lingered longer than they should. But soon, she was the one tending to the flowers outside the church. helping the schoolteacher repair the old windows, or reading stories to the children under the shade of the cottonwoods. Ethan often found reasons to stop by. He'd deliver lumber, repair a fence, or bring Rose to help Miss Clara with the school garden. He told himself it was for Rose's sake, but the truth, as quiet as it was undeniable, lived in the way his gaze softened every time Clara brushed a stray curl behind her ear or laughed at something Rose said. The wind seemed kinder when she was near. One morning, a week before the spring fair, the air was heavy with the promise of rain. The sky hung low, grey and swollen. Ethan was fixing the corral gate when he saw Clara crossing the field, her shawl pressed tightly against her shoulders. "Storm's comin'," he called, wiping his hands on his trousers. She smiled faintly. "So I see. Thought I'd return the book Rose lent me before it gets too bad." Ethan nodded, watching her approach. "You could have waited till morning." Clara hesitated, her eyes flicking toward the clouds. "Maybe I didn't want to wait." He caught the meaning in her tone, not something she said outright, but something that trembled quietly beneath it. She'd been visiting often, yes, but always kept a kind of distance, never staying long enough to linger, never sitting down once her purpose was done. He stepped aside, letting her onto the porch. "Coffee's on the stove if you'd like some." For the first time, she didn't refuse. Inside, the house smelled faintly of pine and bread. Rose's drawings lined one wall, a scattering of colored pages filled with horses, wildflowers, and a tall man beside a smaller woman holding hands. Clara smiled softly at that. "She's got your eyes," she said as Ethan poured 2 mugs. "Lily's too," he replied, the words half a sigh. "Can't look at her without seeing both of us." Clara nodded, tracing the rim of her cup. "I know what that's like. Seeing the ones you love in every corner, even when they're gone." The rain began to fall then, slow at first, then harder, drumming against the roof like distant hooves. The sound filled the silence between them. When Clara looked up, Ethan was watching her, not with pity, but with the kind of understanding that didn't need words. She saw the tired strength in his eyes, the weariness softened by kindness. "You've done well," she said quietly. "Raising her, keeping the ranch. Some days I'm not sure I did any of it right," he admitted. "But she smiles most mornings." "I reckon that's enough." The fire crackled softly. Clara's eyes drifted to the window, where rain blurred the world into watercolor streaks of grey and gold. "It's been a long time since I heard rain like this," she murmured. Ethan tilted his head. "You hear it different now?" She smiled faintly. "I think I just forgot what it felt like, to listen to something that asks nothing of you." He didn't answer. Instead, he leaned back, letting the sound fill the room. And for a rare moment, both of them sat still, 2 souls bound by grief, sharing the kind of silence that heals more than speech ever could. When the storm finally eased, the air smelled of wet earth and lilacs. Clara stood, smoothing her dress. "Thank you, Ethan," she said softly. "For the coffee." "And the quiet. Any time, Clara," he replied, standing too. Then after a pause, he added, "You don't have to keep saying goodbye every time." Her eyes flickered with something unspoken, something tender, and a little afraid. "Maybe one day I'll learn how to stay." She stepped off the porch, and he watched her walk back through the field, the damp grass catching her skirts, the fading light turning her hair the color of autumn wheat. Ethan didn't move for a long time. The sound of the rain still lingered, but beneath it, something else had begun. The slow, uncertain rhythm of a heart remembering how to hope. Spring had come early to Willow Creek that year. The hills rolled green again, dotted with wildflowers, and the river that once ran dry hummed softly under the bridge. The town felt lighter somehow, as if it too was trying to breathe again. Clara found herself at the Carter Ranch more often as the weeks passed. Sometimes to bring fresh bread or sewing for Rose, other times for no reason at all. She'd walk the path through the meadow, a small basket on her arm, telling herself it was kindness, not attachment. But every time she saw Ethan, every time Rose came running to meet her, she knew there was something else drawing her, something she didn't dare name. Ethan welcomed her presence in quiet ways. He'd fix the latch on her garden gate without being asked. Leave a bundle of firewood by her porch. Once when her roof leaked, he came in the rain to mend it himself. He didn't speak much while he worked, only paused once to look at her and say, "You shouldn't have to sleep under a broken roof, Clara." She'd wanted to say, "I haven't slept right in years anyway." But she only nodded, heart full and aching. One afternoon, as the spring fair approached, Rose begged Clara to help her with a dress. They spent the day in the small parlor of Clara's home, the scent of lilacs drifting through the open window, the table scattered with ribbons and needles. "You know," Clara said softly as she adjusted a seam, "your father must be very proud of you." Rose grinned, cheeks dimpled. "He says I remind him of my mama. Do you think she'd be proud too?" Clara's throat tightened. She glanced at the window, at the golden light slipping through. "Yes," she whispered, "more than you can imagine." When Ethan arrived later to walk Rose home, he found them laughing, real laughter, not the fragile kind that disappears too quickly. For a moment, watching from the doorway, he felt something inside him ease. He realized he hadn't heard that sound in his home since Lily died. "Evening, Miss Clara," he said, removing his hat. "Seems you've made my little one a fair lady." Clara smiled, brushing a stray curl from her forehead. "She did most of it herself. I only guided her hands." Ethan looked at her then, really looked. "You've got a way of making everything feel lighter." She blushed faintly, turning away to tidy the table. "You give me too much credit." But that night, as she lay in bed, the words replayed in her mind. "You've got a way of making everything feel lighter." No one had said anything like that to her in years. The next evening, the lanterns were lit for the fair. The whole town gathered. Fiddles played, boots scuffed the dusty ground, laughter rose under the stars. Ethan stood by the fence watching Rose chase fireflies with the other children. He saw Clara near the church steps, her hair pinned loosely, her dress pale blue, eyes bright under the glow of the lanterns. For a moment, she looked like something out of a dream, something that didn't belong to the grief and dust that had defined their lives. When she noticed him watching, she smiled and walked over. "Evening, Mr. Carter," she said with a teasing lilt. He chuckled. "Evening, Miss Whitmore. You look right at home tonight." "I'm trying to be," she said softly. "It's strange. I almost forgot what it's like to laugh without feeling guilty." Ethan's expression grew tender. "You don't owe your sadness to anyone, Clara. You've carried it long enough." She looked up at him, eyes glistening. "And what about you? Do you ever let yourself stop carrying it?" The words struck deep. He didn't answer at once. The music drifted between them, slow and wistful. Finally he said, "I tell myself I'm keeping it for her, for Lily, but maybe I've just been afraid." "Feels wrong to start living again when someone you loved had to stop." Clara nodded, understanding. "Grief tricks us like that. Makes us think loyalty means not healing." He smiled faintly. "You always did have a way of setting a man straight." She laughed softly, shaking her head. "I'm not sure I even know how to set myself straight." They stood there a long while, just listening to the music. Rose came running to them, cheeks flushed from laughter. "Papa, Miss Clara, they're playing the slow dance." Ethan hesitated. "I don't—" But Rose tugged his hand. "Please, Papa." "Mama used to dance." Clara's eyes softened. "She's right. You should dance." Ethan swallowed hard, then turned to her. "Only if you'll join me." Her breath caught. "I haven't danced in years." "Then we'll both be terrible together." And so, under the golden lanterns, surrounded by the hum of fiddles and the scent of spring, Ethan and Clara took each other's hands. It wasn't a perfect dance. Her steps faltered, his boots scuffed. Their laughter came hesitant at first, but there was something whole in that imperfection. For the first time, the ache in their hearts didn't feel like loss. It felt like remembrance, like love, remembered how to breathe again. When the song ended, they stood close, the air between them quiet and full. "Ethan," Clara whispered, "what happens when the music stops?" He looked down at her, voice low and steady. "Then we listen for the next tune." The fair was only a week ago, but for Ethan, it felt like seasons had passed. Every day since, The memory of that dance returned to him, the weight of Clara's hand in his, the way the light caught her hair when she laughed. He'd begun to imagine a future again, quietly and without permission. A morning where Clara's voice joined his and Rose's at breakfast, the sound of her laughter mixing with the clatter of dishes. But hope, he knew, was a fragile thing out here. It could break with a single letter. That letter came on a Tuesday. Clara's father had taken a bad turn. The doctor in the next county urged her to come before the week was out. The news didn't surprise her. Age had been chasing him for years, but the thought of leaving Willow Creek again filled her with a strange kind of dread. That evening she walked to the Carter Ranch to tell Ethan. Rose was feeding the chickens, humming one of the fair tunes. While Ethan mended a saddle strap by the barn door, she waited until Rose had gone inside, then spoke. "I'll be leaving tomorrow," she said. He looked up slowly, brow tightening. "Leavin'? My father's ill. He needs me." He nodded once, setting the strap aside. "Course. Family comes first." But she could see it, the flicker in his eyes, the careful quiet of a man trying not to show what he felt. "I don't know when I'll be back," she added softly. Ethan drew a long breath, gaze falling to the ground. "Then I'll keep the gate mended just in case." She wanted to say something, anything, but words tangled in her throat. When she finally turned to go, he said her name just once, barely above the wind. "Clara." She stopped. He took a step forward, the evening sun sliding over his shoulders. "These months, they've been something I never thought I'd have again. I ain't asking you to promise nothing, but—" He hesitated, voice breaking a little. "Please don't leave without knowing that this place, this life, it's better with you in it." The world went quiet except for the slow creak of the barn door and the cry of a hawk high above. Clara turned, eyes shining. "I don't want to go," she whispered. "But I'm afraid. Every time I've loved something, I've lost it." Ethan closed the distance between them, not touching her yet, only close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, the steadiness. "Then maybe it's time to love something that lasts," he said. "Not perfect, not easy, just real." She met his eyes, the tears she'd held back finally slipping free. "You make it sound simple." He shook his head gently. "Nothing simple about it. But I reckon you and I have done harder things than learning to stay." For a moment they stood like that, caught between leaving and belonging. Then Clara reached for his hand, hesitant at first, then sure. "I'll go see him," she said. "But I'll come back. If you'll still have me." Ethan exhaled, the tension leaving his shoulders in a rush. "You already know the answer." The next morning the stagecoach rumbled down the dusty road. Ethan and Rose stood at the gate, watching Clara wave from the window. And when the dust settled and the sound of wheels faded, Ethan whispered under his breath, more prayer than plea, "Please don't leave." 3 weeks later, just as the summer heat began to hum through the valley, a familiar silhouette appeared on the ridge, a woman in a pale blue dress, a small bag slung over her shoulder. Rose saw her first, shouting from the porch, "Papa!" "She's back." Ethan stepped out, heart hammering. Clara walked down the path toward them, smiling through tears. "My father's resting easy now," she said when she reached him. "He told me to come home." "Home," Ethan repeated softly, the word tasting new and right. That evening, they sat on the porch, watching the last light fade over Willow Creek. Rose fell asleep on the steps, the crickets tuning their summer song. Ethan turned to Clara, his voice low. "You sure you're ready for all this quiet?" She leaned her head against his shoulder. After everything, quiet sounds a lot like peace. And as the lantern flickered beside them, the stars unfolded above, and the town that had held so much sorrow finally rested easy. For love, at last, had learned to stay,